It was the kind of night that turned dirt roads into rivers and lit the prairie sky with thunder. Rain fell hard on the roof of an old ranch house tucked deep in the Wyoming frontier, miles from the nearest town, farther still from the noise of the world. Inside sat a man named Eli Thatcher, weathered by war and years alone, living in a house built more for ghosts than company. He had long since stopped waiting for change. But just before midnight, as the wind howled like wolves in mourning, someone knocked at his door. Then came another, and another, until 6 women, drenched and silent, stood on his porch with eyes that carried storms of their own. They didn't speak at first, not a single one, just stared at him like he was the last soul on earth who might understand what they had run from. Their dresses clung to them like grief, mud on their hems, shadows under their eyes. Eli, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in a week, stepped aside without asking questions. He didn't need to. There was something about them, something that didn't need explaining. And in that moment, as thunder cracked above and the lantern flickered behind him, the quiet man who had spent 20 years shutting out the world opened his door and changed 6 lives forever. This is not the kind of story you'll find in town ledgers or family Bibles. No sheriff wrote it down. No church ever blessed it. It happened in the forgotten corners of the West, where law fades and something older takes its place. These 6 women carried secrets darker than the storm that drove them. And Eli, who had sworn off the burden of other people's pain, would become the keeper of their sanctuary. Not because he was a hero, but because something inside him knew. Some storms aren't meant to be faced alone. What followed was not salvation in the way most understand it. It was messier than that, quieter, but more powerful than anything Eli had ever known. Over time, the ranch became more than shelter. It became a covenant, a place where wounded women found the courage to stand again, where silence was not emptiness, but a space to breathe, and where a man who thought his life had ended found, at last, what it meant to begin again. And now, you'll hear the story of what brought them to his door, of what kept them there, and of the wild, beautiful truth they built together in a world that had tried to break them. This is not a tale of charity. It is a tale of redemption, of love born in rain, and of a house that healed not just 6 women, but the man who let them in. The first to arrive was a girl no older than 20. She didn't knock hard, just one slow tap, like she wasn't sure she was allowed. Eli opened the door to find her soaked through, eyes down, hands trembling. Her name was Lorna, and her voice was barely a whisper. She didn't give her story that night, only her name. Eli offered a blanket, a chair by the fire, and silence. She accepted all 3 like they were lifelines. He thought that would be the end of it, until the second knock came, not 10 minutes later. This time it was a woman named Ruth. Older, proud posture, cracked lips, eyes that had seen too much. She didn't ask to come in. She just looked Eli in the eye and stepped over the threshold like it was something she'd earned. She removed her hat and placed it carefully on the hook by the door. Eli said nothing. He didn't know what to say. Ruth sat near Lorna, and though they didn't speak, a glance passed between them that said more than words ever could. By the time the third knock came, the rain had turned to sleet. Her name was June. Then came Miriam. Then Elsie. Then the last, the smallest of them all, little Calla, no more than 16, with shoes too big and a bruise she tried to hide beneath her bonnet. Each one different, each one quiet, each one carrying something invisible on their shoulders. Eli, who had never been known for his hospitality, found himself gathering dry clothes from old trunks, warming soup, and bringing down extra quilts from the attic. The house, once silent as a grave, filled with movement, light footsteps, the clink of spoons, the rustle of wool drying near the fire. Eli kept expecting one of them to speak, to explain, to make sense of it, but none did. Not that first night. They slept in corners and on rugs and under the stairs, curled like animals that had finally found a place to rest. And Eli sat by the window, rifle across his lap, staring into the dark, wondering what force had chosen his house as their haven. By morning, the storm had passed, but the women stayed. None asked to leave. None packed a thing. Eli made coffee, thick and bitter, and watched as 6 strangers began to move through his home like they belonged to it. He didn't question it. He only watched, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of grief and old solitude, he knew Whatever had brought them here wasn't finished yet. For the first few days, the rhythm of the house changed like the turning of seasons. Eli found himself waking earlier, listening for footsteps that weren't his own. The women had begun tending to the place with gentle hands, sweeping, chopping wood, scrubbing dishes he hadn't touched in years. No one asked them to. It was as if survival had taught them that belonging had to be earned through motion. Eli didn't stop them. He let it happen, quietly grateful for the life returning to his home without permission. Still, no one spoke of the past. Not fully, but hints emerged. Lorna would flinch at the sound of hooves. June never touched a man's coat. Ruth's fingers bore deep scars, and when she thought no one was looking, she'd run them over the back of a wooden chair like it was someone else's skin. Calla had nightmares. Low cries in the night that Eli pretended not to hear, but which kept him awake more surely than gunfire. They were not just lost women. They were escaped women. Each one had run from something, and run towards something she didn't yet understand. Eli didn't ask questions, but he did what he could. He repaired the second-floor windows, reinforced the barn door. He moved his old desk from the parlor to the barn so the women would have more space. And when Calla asked if she could plant something, he gave her a patch of land near the south wall. By week's end, beans and corn had been seeded, and tiny sprouts began to break the soil. Life, it seemed, was insisting on itself. They began sharing meals together, sitting on crates, barrels, anything that could hold weight. Laughter came slowly, at first like a foreign language, then like something remembered. Miriam hummed while she cooked. Elsie stitched new curtains from scraps of cloth. June read aloud from Eli's old books at night. And though the air still carried ghosts, the weight of silence began to soften. Eli hadn't known how much he missed the sound of voices until he heard them echoing through the walls of his father's house. But with peace came questions. Why were they here? What had tied them together? And most of all, how long before the world they fled from came knocking to? Eli didn't say it aloud, but he felt it in his bones. The storm that had brought them wasn't finished. It had only shifted skies. And when it returned, it wouldn't be rain it carried. It would be reckoning. The change in the land was subtle but certain. Birds that had long avoided the ranch now sang in the early light. The soil, once hardened by drought and neglect, grew softer beneath Calla's bare feet. The house, too, transformed. Old wallpaper peeled away to reveal wood that breathed easier in the warmth of laughter. There were no ceremonies, no vows made in writing, but something sacred was forming between them. It was in the way June left an extra portion of stew by the fire for whoever woke last. In the way Ruth mended Eli's coat without a word, then folded it neatly on his chair. Small acts, heavy with meaning. Eli had lived many lives before the war, and one more after it. A life of silence, whiskey, and land that refused to forgive. But now, as he watched 6 women turn a place of memory into a living home, he felt himself shift. He still didn't ask what they'd run from, but he began to wonder why they trusted him. A man with a gun always nearby. A man with no soft history to lean on. Perhaps it was because he didn't pry. Or perhaps it was because he saw them not as broken, but as brave. One afternoon, while fixing a loose hinge on the barn door, Eli noticed Lorna sitting in the grass, braiding Calla's hair. He watched the two of them, a girl and a woman who barely knew each other, smiling without speaking. It hit him then. These weren't simply survivors. They were becoming sisters, the kind not made by blood, but by fire. Each had come to his door alone, but together, they had begun to build something even war couldn't burn down. The peace held for weeks. The days were full of labor, the nights full of stories, half told, half sung, but always real. One by one, pieces of their past began to surface. Ruth had once been a preacher's wife until his hands turned cruel. June had fled from a traveling merchant who kept her locked in the back of a wagon like property. Miriam had buried a child no one mourned but her. Elsie had been traded between men like coin. Calla, no one knew yet, but her eyes said more than words could ever hold. Eli listened. He carried their pain the way he carried fence posts, without complaint, but always with care. And when the women noticed he had carved 6 notches into the beam above the hearth, one for each of them, they didn't ask why. They only smiled, because they understood this was not his house anymore. It was theirs, It was just before dawn when the first sign came. A rider on the ridge, too far to see his face, but close enough for Eli to feel it in his gut. The silhouette held too long. The horse didn't graze. It watched. Ruth noticed it too. Her hand trembled as she set her coffee down, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her voice cracked. "It's starting," she said. No one needed her to explain. The storm had found them. Eli saddled his horse that afternoon, rode out to the edge of the property, and returned with a face carved from stone. "One man. For now," he told the women. "But more will come." He didn't say how he knew. They trusted his silence by now. That night, no one slept. They checked window locks, placed lanterns by each doorway. Eli moved his rifle beside the kitchen table. But what shook him more than the threat was the look in their eyes. They weren't scared for themselves. They were scared for each other. Calla came to him in the middle of the night, barefoot and wrapped in a quilt. "We won't run again," she said, voice low but firm. "Not this time." Eli didn't answer, but he laid a hand gently on her shoulder. There was something in her, despite her youth, that had already made the decision. They had spent their lives running. But this house, this ground, had been made holy by the act of choosing it. And now, they would fight for it. Not with bullets alone, but with unity. The next morning, the women gathered by the barn and began reinforcing the fence line. Ruth carried nails in her apron. June sharpened tools. Miriam turned over barrels and prepared traps. No one waited to be told what to do. They worked in silence, each action heavy with purpose. Eli, for once, followed rather than led. This wasn't just defense, it was declaration. "We are here. We're not going back." And as dusk fell and lanterns lit the windows once more, Eli stood in the center of the yard and looked around. Not at 6 victims, but 6 warriors. Not a band of broken souls, but a family forged by choice. He exhaled, slow and deep. Whatever came next, whoever came knocking, it would not find them alone. Not anymore. The waiting became its own kind of war. Days passed without sight of another rider, but no one relaxed. The tension lived in the space between heartbeats, in the way Ruth double-checked the latch on every window, and how June always kept one eye on the horizon while hanging clothes to dry. But in the stillness, something else began to take root: resolve. Each woman, once hunted and silent, now walked the land like it belonged to her. The fear didn't vanish, but it no longer held the reins. One night, as the wind howled and the trees swayed like whispering giants, Miriam finally told her whole story. She sat near the fire, hands clasped in her lap, voice low and even. She spoke of the man who called himself her husband, of the child she buried alone, of the day she ran barefoot for miles with nothing but a tin locket in her pocket. When she finished, no one spoke. They didn't need to. Calla reached for her hand. Lorna wept quietly, and even Eli felt the fire's heat sting his eyes more than usual. Miriam's story opened a floodgate. Over the next few evenings, each woman shared her own pain, not out of obligation, but because they were no longer afraid of being seen. June spoke of nights in the back of a wagon, chained beside tools. Ruth admitted that she had once wished for death more than freedom. And Calla, when her time came, she said only 4 words: "He was my father." That was enough. No one pressed further. Their stories hung in the room like incense. Heavy, sacred, unforgettable. Eli didn't speak of his own past, but the women didn't ask. They could see it in the way he limped after long days, and how he sometimes stared too long at the hills beyond the barn. They understood. Pain recognizes pain, and healing, in its truest form, needs no explanation, only presence. So when Eli stood from the table one night and said, "If trouble comes through that front gate, it'll have to pass through me first," they believed him, not because of his rifle, but because of the way he had stayed. And in that moment, the house felt fuller than ever before. It was not a shelter anymore. It was a fortress, built from stories, from sweat, from scars turned to steel. They weren't waiting for rescue. They were the rescue. And Eli, who once believed himself too broken to be part of anyone's life, now stood at the center of a storm he didn't start, but one he was ready to finish. It was on the 12th morning that they came. 3 riders, dusty, slow-moving, but deliberate. No words were spoken as they approached the house. Eli had seen these kinds of men before: bounty hunters, drifters, the type who believed silence meant permission and a woman's past was worth a price. He stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, boots planted firm. The women stood behind him, not hiding, not trembling, but ready. This time, they would not be taken. The lead rider tipped his hat, his smile more snake than man. "We're just looking to ask a few questions," he drawled. "Heard tell some folks pass this way, folks who don't belong to you." Eli didn't flinch. "No one here belongs to anyone," he said flatly. "You got questions, ask the wind. That's all that'll answer you." The rider's smile faltered. He looked past Eli, saw the women standing like sentinels, and something changed in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe even fear. Not of Eli, of what he couldn't understand. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. The threat was in their presence. But the women didn't blink. Ruth stepped forward beside Eli, arms crossed. "Try and take us," she said. "Just try." The youngest rider shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. The third man spat into the dirt and muttered, "Ain't worth it." The lead rider hesitated a moment longer, then tugged the reins. "Let's go," he barked. And just like that, they turned and rode off into the morning light. No one moved until the sound of hooves faded into nothing. Then, slowly, breath returned to the house. Lorna leaned against the porch post. Calla wiped her face with the back of her hand. Eli lowered the shotgun. No cheers were shouted. No tears were shed. Just a quiet understanding that something permanent had just happened. They had stood their ground, and it had held. That evening, Eli cooked supper. Ruth set the table. The sun bled over the hills in streaks of gold and crimson, and the silence was no longer fear, it was reverence. The women sat together not as survivors, but as victors. And Eli, for the first time in years, allowed himself a rare thing, a smile. Not for the fight they had won, but for the life they had chosen. One made not from ashes, but from courage. One they had built together. The days that followed felt different. Not because the threat was gone, but because they had seen what they were capable of when they stood as one. The land seemed to breathe easier, too. The soil turned richer, the wind softer. Birds built nests in the rafters of the barn again. Even the stubborn oak by the creek, long thought dead, sprouted new green. It was as if the ranch itself had been waiting for something, or someone, to bring it back to life. And now that they had, it responded in kind. Eli noticed the change in the women, too. Lorna laughed more. Miriam sang while tending the chickens. Calla no longer jumped at every creak of wood or rustle of wind. Ruth, once always watching the door, began sewing again. Not patches, but dresses. Dresses she said no one ever let her wear. June, who had feared touch, now braided the other's hair in the golden light of afternoon. The house felt like a heartbeat, steady and strong. And Eli, he no longer sat alone at night. Though none said it aloud, they knew what they had created was rare, more rare than gold, than land, than anything men killed over in the West. It was home, not just a roof, not just a kitchen or bed, but a place where the past could exist without defining the future, where pain wasn't erased, but honored, where no one had to be anyone but exactly who they were. And in a land known for erasing the weak, they had carved a space for truth to live. One morning, while repairing the front fence, Calla came running from the field with a letter in her hand. A drifter had passed it off to her. No name, no return. Just a single folded page sealed with wax. Eli opened it slowly. The handwriting was clean, the words simple. It read, "We won't forget this, but neither will we return." That was it. No threats, no names, just closure. The past, for once, had chosen to stay in the past. They burned the letter that night in the fire. Not out of fear, but release. The world outside had turned a page, and now so would they. The flames danced high and orange into the sky, and the 6 women watched it in silence. Not a single one flinched, because now, when the wind howled across the hills, it sounded like freedom. Spring arrived with a kind of grace the ranch had never known. Wildflowers bloomed along the porch steps, bees returned to the grove near the south fence, and the vegetable patch that Calla had planted sprouted so full they began trading food with neighbors miles out. Word of the house on the hill began to spread, not as a place of scandal, but as a place of peace. And slowly, cautiously, others began to follow the path once carved in storm and silence. It started with a young widow who rode 3 days alone, guided only by rumor. She came with nothing but a satchel and eyes hollowed by grief. Ruth opened the door, handed her tea, and said, "We've been waiting for you." Then came another, a mother and child who had lost everything to fire. Miriam took them in, no questions asked. Then another, and another. Eli expanded the barn. Lorna taught the children to read. June began writing down everyone's name, their story, their arrival. A ledger of survival. Of belonging. Eli built a new table with his own hands. Long, sturdy, enough to hold 15. Then 20. By midsummer, the house held not just 6 women, but nearly a dozen others. They called it Hollow Creek, though no one remembered who named it first. What mattered was that it stood, not just on land, but on principle. You arrived as you were. You worked if you could. You stayed as long as you needed. No past was too heavy. No name too broken. Calla, now taller, stronger, took to riding into town once a week with Eli. She wore her hair up now, carried herself with a quiet pride. She would smile at the women passing in shop windows, tip her hat to the men who once muttered behind their beards. She no longer feared who she was. She had faced the storm and bloomed in its wake. And Eli, once a man of silence, of shadow, of regret, walked each evening along the porch as the sun dipped low. He looked out over the fields, the gardens, the children running barefoot in the dust, the women laughing in the kitchen, and knew without doubt the West hadn't tamed them. They had tamed the West, not with violence, not with gold, but with something far more powerful, healing. And the house that once stood empty now stood eternal. The seasons turned again, and Hollow Creek became more than a home. It became a legend whispered between ranches, sung low around campfires, and carried by traders moving through the dust. Folks began leaving gifts at the fence, sacks of grain, fresh linens, seeds in glass jars. No names attached, no word spoken, just offerings to a place that had become sacred ground. A place where the wounded healed, where the forgotten were remembered, and where no one asked what sins rode in your saddlebags. The house grew, but never lost its soul. Children born under its roof took their first steps on wooden floors worn, soft by mercy. Women who had once spoken in broken pieces now told stories by lamplight, passing down strength like heirlooms. June led evening prayers, not the kind read from books, but from memory, from breath, from gratitude. Ruth planted an orchard in the east field. Miriam organized lessons beneath the cottonwood trees. And Lorna painted a sign for the front gate. All storms pass. You are safe here. Eli aged, but not in the way most men did. His hands still built, his shoulders still bore weight, but his eyes, once hard as canyon stone, now held a softness that made children run to him without fear. He rarely spoke of the war anymore, and when asked, simply said, "I found my peace after the battle." His rifle still hung by the door, but it gathered dust now, untouched. Protection no longer came from gunpowder. It came from presence, from unity, from the quiet force of people who had chosen each other. One afternoon, a young girl born and raised at Hollow Creek asked Eli, "Why do they keep coming?" He looked out over the hills and said, "Because the world keeps breaking hearts, and hearts keep needing somewhere to mend." The girl nodded, not fully understanding, but somehow already carrying the wisdom behind his words. Because Hollow Creek wasn't just healing those who arrived. It was raising a new generation who never had a run in the first place. And so it continued. The door stayed open. The fire never died. And the legacy, once sparked by 6 knocks in the rain, grew like a great oak, its roots deep, its branches wide. A refuge born in silence. A revolution built in softness. And the man who once believed his life had ended found, in the quiet strength of 6 wounded women, the beginning of something eternal. Years later, long after Eli's boots had stopped marking the porch and his hands had returned to the earth he once worked, people still came. Not to grieve, but to give thanks. They sat on the wide front steps where stories had been shared, where fears had dissolved in laughter. They walked the ground slowly, reverently, like stepping on a sacred soil. And when they reached the wooden beam above the hearth, where 6 small notches had once been carved, they often ran their fingers across it like braille. 6 notches, 6 lives that changed 100 more. The legend of Hollow Creek became part of the land's own memory. It was never shouted, never boasted, just passed gently from soul to soul. They said it was the only place west of the Mississippi where no lock had ever been used on a door, where no woman ever left in shame, where even men found the courage to put down their weapons and pick up something softer, a seed, a tool, a truth. In town, older folks would pause when telling the tale. Some still remembered seeing Eli and Calla ride in for supplies, back when her hair was wild and his hat-shaded eyes still fierce. They saved each other. They'd whisper. And then they saved us all. No one argued. Because by then, even those who once doubted had sent someone to the ranch, to heal, to rest, to start again. A new caretaker tended Hollow Creek now. A young woman with strong arms and a voice like Miriam's. The ledger June started was still kept, thick with names, notes, dates. But no one counted numbers. They only counted hearts. And every time a new hand knocked on the old wooden door, someone inside would answer with the same words Eli had once spoken, long ago. Come in. You're home now. And though Eli Thatcher no longer walked the porch, and the 6 who first knocked now rode in the wind, their story lived on. Etched into walls, sewn into quilts, whispered in dreams. Because sometimes the West didn't need more heroes. Sometimes it needed one man willing to open the door, and 6 women brave enough to walk through it. In a world where most doors remain closed to the wounded, the forgotten, or the ones who simply chose to survive, Hollow Creek became more than a home. It became a promise. A promise that even the most broken stories deserve to be heard. That even in a land as wild and ruthless as the West once was, there's space for softness, for mercy, for redemption. 6 knocks in the rain began something no law could define, no map could chart. A refuge not built from stone or wood, but from shared pain turned into power. Eli Thatcher never set out to be a savior. He was just a man with a past, a quiet soul weathered by war and loss. But sometimes, that's all it takes. One person who says yes when the world says no. One soul who opens the door without needing to ask why. And in that small act of courage, something greater takes root. What those 6 women found wasn't shelter from the storm. It was the strength to stand inside it, together. Their journey wasn't about escape. It was about return. Return to themselves. To trust. To dignity. And the legacy they left behind wasn't written in marble, but in the way laughter echoed down the hallway, in the way seeds grew where blood once soaked the ground. They turned a place of silence into a home of song. And their story, like all stories that matter, didn't end with survival. It blossomed into something eternal. So perhaps the real lesson is this. When someone knocks at your door, drenched in rain and carrying more than they can say, listen. Look them in the eye. Make room. Because sometimes the miracle isn't in what you offer them. It's in what they awaken in you. And when we choose compassion over fear, presence over judgment, we don't just change lives. We build legacies that echo far beyond our own. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of the kind of world we can create together, then don't let the moment fade. Subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. Leave a comment sharing what this meant to you, and like the video if it gave you hope. Because every act of connection matters. And somewhere out there, someone else may be waiting for your door to open.